In July 1944, as Allied forces pushed inland from the Normandy beaches across northern France, the 332nd Field Hospital faced a critical medical crisis that threatened the lives of hundreds. The 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion, an all-black combat unit, had suffered devastating casualties during a German counterattack near Saint-Lô. Over 200 wounded men arrived at the already overwhelmed medical facility within hours, many with life-threatening injuries requiring immediate intervention. Archival footage shows the chaotic scene. Ambulances arriving in steady streams, medical personnel rushing between makeshift tents erected in muddy fields, and long rows of wounded men lying on stretchers awaiting treatment. The 332nd, one of the few integrated medical units in the European theatre, had been established just 3 days earlier in an abandoned school building 5 miles behind the front lines. They were still organizing their equipment when the casualties began pouring in. Among the most critical shortages facing the medical staff was blood plasma, essential for treating shock and blood loss in severely wounded patients. The hospital had been allocated supplies based on expected casualty rates, but the ferocity of the German counterattack had resulted in numbers far exceeding those projections. Major Robert Wilson, the hospital's chief surgeon, wrote in his daily report, "Plasma supplies critically low. Current reserves insufficient for incoming casualties. Resupply convoy delayed by enemy action on main supply route. Prognosis for critical cases extremely poor without adequate blood products." Many wounded soldiers from the 614th had suffered extensive burns when their vehicles were hit by German artillery, creating a desperate need for fluid replacement therapy. Others had multiple traumatic injuries from shell fragments, resulting in severe blood loss. Without adequate plasma, these men faced almost certain death. The triage nurses had begun placing black tags, indicating expectant status, meaning too severely injured to save with available resources, on an increasing number of the wounded. Dr. James Harrison, the hospital's senior surgeon, called an emergency staff meeting as the situation deteriorated. "I need to be direct," he told the assembled doctors and nurses, his voice hoarse from 18 hours of continuous surgery. "We have 20 units of plasma left. We have over 60 men who need it immediately to survive. Supply trucks are at least 36 hours away, assuming they get through at all." The room fell silent as the implications became clear. They would have to decide who would receive the remaining plasma, effectively determining who would live and who would die. It was at this moment that Lieutenant Dorothy Redmond spoke up from the back of the room. A 34-year-old black woman from Philadelphia, she had overcome extraordinary obstacles to earn her nursing degree from Mercy Douglas Hospital School of Nursing, one of the few institutions that trained black nurses in the pre-war years. Before joining the Army Nurse Corps in 1942, Redmond had worked for 5 years at Provident Hospital in Baltimore, where she had developed expertise in emergency medicine and laboratory procedures under often challenging conditions. A surviving photograph shows Redmond in her Army uniform, a determined woman with intelligent eyes and an expression of quiet confidence beneath her nurse's cap. Former colleagues described her as methodical and resourceful, someone who approached problems with a unique perspective, forged by years of working in underfunded hospitals that served the black community. "Dorothy could make something from nothing," recalled Dr. William Stevens, who had worked with her at Provident Hospital. "In civilian practice, our hospital always had to make do with less. She learned to improvise when others would give up." "I may have a way to extend our plasma supply," Redmond said to Dr. Harrison and the assembled staff, her voice calm but authoritative. "It's unconventional, but I believe it could work." The medical team looked at her with a mixture of skepticism and desperate hope. Several of the white doctors exchanged glances, clearly dubious that a black nurse might have a solution they hadn't considered. Redmond explained that standard blood plasma could potentially be extended with a carefully formulated mixture of saline, albumin extracted from available blood donations, and certain proteins that could be derived from medical-grade gelatin in the hospital's supply. It won't be identical to standard plasma, but it could provide enough of the critical components to stabilize these men until supplies arrive. In normal circumstances, blood products were prepared under strict laboratory conditions with specialized equipment. Creating a plasma substitute in a field hospital with limited resources seemed impossible to many of the doctors. Major Wilson frowned deeply. "Lieutenant Redmond, we're talking about introducing a completely untested solution directly into patients' circulatory systems. The risk of adverse reactions is significant," Redmond acknowledged without hesitation. "But I believe we can create a safe enough product to serve as a bridge treatment. The alternative is watching these men die when we might have saved them." She outlined her proposed method: careful blood typing of all available donors, separation of components using the hospital's limited centrifuge equipment, and a rigorous sterility protocol using the equipment available in their small laboratory tent. Dr. Harrison studied Redmond thoughtfully. After 20 years as a surgeon, including service in the previous war, he had learned to recognize innovation born of necessity. "It's unorthodox," he admitted, rubbing his tired eyes. "But these are unorthodox times." He turned to Redmond. "How quickly can you prepare a test batch?" "Give me 3 hours," she replied with quiet certainty. As Redmond left to begin her work, Dr. Harrison addressed the remaining staff. "Let me be clear," he said soberly. "Without plasma, those men are already lost. I'm authorizing this attempt." The experimental treatment was officially designated Alternative Plasma Protocol in the medical logs. But among the staff, it quickly became known as Redmond's Mix. What followed was a remarkable feat of improvisation, drawing on Redmond's unique combination of nursing experience and laboratory knowledge. The first challenge was establishing a functional workspace in the chaotic field hospital. Redmond commandeered a corner of the medical supply tent, setting up a makeshift laboratory on a folding table. Working methodically amid the sounds of distant artillery, she began the process of creating a life-saving plasma substitute from basic components. Military supply records show that Redmond requisitioned saline solution, medical-grade gelatin, albumin preserved from earlier blood donations, and various laboratory supplies. Using the hospital's only microscope and a small centrifuge normally used for analyzing blood samples, she began the delicate process of separating and recombining blood components to create a viable plasma substitute. The process was painstaking and precise. Redmond first needed to extract albumin, a critical protein in blood plasma, from the limited blood supplies that remained. Using a fractional precipitation technique she had learned during her civilian hospital work, she carefully separated the components, measuring concentrations with the limited equipment available. To create the suspension medium for these proteins, she prepared a precisely balanced saline solution, then added small amounts of medical-grade gelatin that had been purified through a multi-stage filtration system she designed using surgical gauze and filter paper. The resulting solution needed to match the osmotic pressure and protein content of natural plasma as closely as possible, a formidable challenge without advanced laboratory equipment. Throughout this process, maintaining sterility was paramount. Redmond implemented rigorous sterilization protocols, using the hospital's autoclave and alcohol baths to ensure that contamination would not endanger patients already fighting for their lives. By evening, Redmond presented Dr. Harrison with the first batch of her improvised plasma substitute, enough to treat 10 patients. The cloudy, straw-colored liquid looked remarkably similar to standard plasma. Laboratory technician Sergeant James Murphy had conducted basic tests confirming it had the appropriate pH and protein content to be potentially viable. We'll test it first on volunteers with non-critical injuries, Harrison decided after examining the product. If they show no adverse reactions, we'll begin administering it to the critical cases. 4 hospital orderlies, impressed by Redmond's determination, volunteered to receive small amounts of the substitute plasma to establish its safety. Over the next 6 hours, the volunteers were carefully monitored. None showed any signs of adverse reactions. Blood samples taken before and after administration showed promising results. The substitute plasma was being incorporated into their circulatory systems without triggering rejection or inflammation. With this limited but encouraging evidence, Dr. Harrison authorized the use of Redmond's plasma mix for the most critical patients from the 614th Battalion. The first to receive the treatment was Sergeant William Morris, a tank destroyer commander suffering from severe blood loss after shrapnel wounds to his legs and abdomen. His condition was deteriorating rapidly, his blood pressure dangerously low. As nurses held flashlights in the dimly lit treatment tent, Dr. Harrison personally administered the first unit of the improvised plasma, while Redmond monitored the patient's vital signs. The medical staff watched anxiously over the next hours, knowing they were attempting something unprecedented in field medicine. By morning, Morris's condition had stabilized. His blood pressure had improved, and laboratory values showed he was no longer in critical shock. The improvised plasma substitute had performed its function without apparent adverse effects. Dr. Harrison immediately authorized the use of the remaining units on other critical patients from the 614th. Word spread quickly through the hospital about Redmond's miracle. She immediately began organizing a team of nurses and medical technicians to produce larger quantities using her protocol. Within 48 hours, they had established a production system that could prepare 30 units daily, enough to keep the most critical patients alive until regular supplies could reach them. As the fighting continued to rage across the Norman countryside, Redmond's innovation would face its greatest test as more wounded arrived and the supply situation remained critical. While fierce battles continued across the hedgerows of Normandy, Lieutenant Dorothy Redmond and her hastily assembled team were fighting their own war against time and limited resources. The improvised plasma mix had shown initial promise, but scaling up production while maintaining safety presented enormous challenges. The survival of an entire battalion's wounded hung in the balance. Redmond's background gave her unique insights into the problem at hand. Before the war, she had worked in hospitals that frequently faced supply shortages, requiring medical staff to find creative solutions. More specifically, during her final year at Provident Hospital, she had assisted Dr. Charles Drew, the pioneering black physician who revolutionized blood banking techniques, during his visit to establish a blood collection system. That experience had given her first-hand knowledge of blood component separation and preservation that few nurses possessed. The science of blood products in the 1940s was still developing rapidly. The basics of plasma transfusion had been established years earlier, but the war had accelerated research and practical applications. Standard plasma used in military hospitals was typically dried plasma that could be reconstituted with sterile water, a format developed largely through Dr. Drew's research. This dried plasma eliminated the need for blood typing and had a much longer shelf life than whole blood, making it ideal for battlefield medicine. Redmond understood that she couldn't replicate the complex process of creating dried plasma in a field hospital. Instead, her innovation focused on extending the limited components available to her through careful separation and recombination with suitable substitutes. The resulting product couldn't replace all functions of true plasma, but it could provide the critical volume expansion and protein support needed to keep wounded soldiers alive during the crucial 24-48 hours until proper supplies arrived. In her improvised laboratory, Redmond established a multi-stage production process. First, the limited whole blood available, primarily from non-combat personnel who volunteered as donors, was centrifuged to separate red cells from plasma. The plasma was then heat-treated to reduce the risk of disease transmission, a technique she had learned from Dr. Drew's work. For the protein component, she employed a fractional precipitation method using ethanol from the hospital's medical supplies. This allowed her to concentrate albumin, the most critical protein in plasma for maintaining blood volume and osmotic pressure. This concentrated albumin became the core of her substitute. To extend this limited supply of albumin, Redmond incorporated purified gelatin, which had properties similar enough to plasma proteins to help maintain blood volume. The careful balance of these components was crucial. Too little protein would render the solution ineffective for treating shock, while improperly prepared solutions could trigger dangerous reactions in already compromised patients. Perhaps most impressive was Redmond's quality control system. Without access to advanced testing equipment, she developed a series of simple but effective checks: viscosity tests using timed flow through standardized glass tubes, protein precipitation tests using heat, and microscopic examination for particulate contamination. Photographs from the hospital archives show Redmond's makeshift laboratory, test tubes carefully arranged in racks salvaged from ammunition boxes, a modified centrifuge powered by a Jeep battery when generator power was unreliable, and handwritten charts tracking the properties of each batch. The genius of Redmond's system wasn't just the formula, noted Dr. Eleanor Reed, a medical historian who later studied this innovation. It was her implementation of a quality control process that maintained surprisingly high standards under near-impossible conditions. She essentially created a field-expedient pharmaceutical production protocol that bridged the gap between laboratory ideal and battlefield reality. As the first full day of expanded production proceeded, Redmond methodically documented each step and result. Her notebook, preserved in Army Medical Corps archives, shows detailed observations on each batch. Batch number 4. Solution clear after final filtration. Protein precipitation test negative. Heat stability maintained. 8 units produced, all properly sealed and labeled. The hospital's pathologist, Captain Robert Winters, was assigned to examine random samples from each batch. Initially skeptical, he became an important ally after seeing the consistent quality of Redmond's work. "Whatever theoretical objections I had to this approach," he wrote in the medical log, "are outweighed by both the emergency circumstances and the remarkable consistency Lieutenant Redmond has achieved with minimal equipment." The second major challenge was ensuring the substitute plasma could be safely administered. Standard plasma transfusion sets were designed for conventional products, and proper administration was critical to preventing adverse reactions. Redmond worked with Captain Thomas Reynolds, the hospital's supply officer, to modify standard transfusion equipment for use with her substitute plasma. Using small glass connectors salvaged from damaged medical equipment, they created filtering attachments that provided an additional safety check during administration. This modification ensured that any potential particulates that might have formed during storage would be caught before reaching the patient. The delivery system included careful temperature control as well. Redmond determined that her plasma substitute was most stable and caused fewer reactions when administered at body temperature. She designed warming containers using metal ammunition boxes lined with insulating bandages, with precise thermometers to monitor temperature during administration. By July 23rd, 3 days into the crisis, Redmond's team of 5 nurses, 2 medical technicians, and 3 corpsmen who had volunteered their off-duty hours had produced over 80 units of the improvised plasma. Hospital records show that 37 patients from the 614th Battalion had already received the treatment, with remarkably few adverse reactions given the emergency nature of the product. The documented reactions were generally mild, 6 cases of elevated temperature, 2 cases of urticaria, hives, and 1 case of transient hypertension that resolved quickly with adjustment of the infusion rate. Given that these patients were already severely injured and compromised, this safety profile was considered exceptional by the medical staff. As word of the innovation spread to nearby medical units also struggling with supply shortages, requests for information began to arrive at the 332nd. Redmond prepared a detailed 2-page instruction document titled Emergency Plasma Substitute Preparation Using Field Hospital Resources, which was copied and dispatched to several nearby field hospitals. On July 24th, the hospital received a visit from Colonel Edward Mason from the Army Surgeon General's office. He had heard reports of the unconventional treatment being employed and had come to investigate, potentially to halt what might be considered dangerous experimentation. Instead, after observing Redmond's operation and reviewing the careful documentation and patient outcomes, he became an advocate. "I expected to find well-intentioned but dangerous improvisation," he reportedly told Dr. Harrison. "Instead, I've found one of the most impressive examples of scientific adaptation I've seen in 20 years of military medicine." Mason authorized additional resources to be diverted to the 302nd to support the production effort, including a larger centrifuge, additional laboratory supplies, and most crucially, more medical personnel to assist with the increasingly complex operation. The validation from higher medical authority boosted morale among the hospital staff, who had been working under the constant stress of both tactical uncertainty and ethical questions surrounding the use of an improvised blood product. Redmond's methodical approach, transparent process, and careful documentation had demonstrated that innovation could be both desperately needed and responsibly implemented. As the battle for St. Lo intensified, bringing more casualties to the already overwhelmed hospital, the demands on Redmond's plasma production unit grew. The temporary production line she had established was now operating around the clock, with 3 shifts of personnel working in carefully choreographed sequence. Redmond continued to refine the process, addressing new challenges as they arose. When the hospital's supply of medical gelatin ran low, she adapted her formula to incorporate alternative colloids available in the medical supplies. When the electrical generators faltered during a fuel shortage, she developed manual centrifuge techniques that, while less efficient, allowed production to continue during power outages. Throughout this period, Redmond maintained her regular nursing duties in the surgical ward during her off hours, sometimes working 20-hour days. Colleagues recalled her calm demeanor even under extreme stress, her ability to teach others quickly and clearly, and her unfailing attention to detail, all factors that undoubtedly saved many lives during this crisis. By July 27th, the hospital had treated 142 wounded men from the 614th Battalion using Redmond's plasma substitute. Of these, 119 had survived injuries that the medical staff had initially considered likely fatal, given the supply situation. Dr. Harrison's medical log noted, "Alternative plasma protocol exceeding all expectations. Patient survival rates approaching those achievable with standard supplies. Letty Redmond's innovation has effectively prevented a mass casualty situation among the 614th wounded." As July came to a close, the hospital's regular supply lines were finally re-established as Allied forces secured the surrounding area. Standard medical supplies, including conventional plasma, began to reach the hospital in significant quantities. Redmond's emergency production gradually scaled back as the need for her substitute diminished. In the final analysis, hospital records documented 187 patients who had received the improvised plasma therapy during the crisis, with 156 of them surviving injuries that had been classified as likely fatal without plasma treatment. Dr. Harrison's final report on the emergency protocol stated, "The improvised plasma substitute developed by Lieutenant Redmond unquestionably saved the majority of the 614th Battalion's critically wounded men, patients who had effectively been written off given our supply situation. This represents not merely an emergency stopgap, but a significant medical achievement worthy of further research and development. By early August 1944, news of Lieutenant Dorothy Redmond's life-saving innovation had spread through medical channels across the European theatre of operations. Her detailed protocol document was being distributed to field hospitals with orders from the Army Surgeon General's office to implement training in the emergency technique. Yet as her professional contribution gained recognition, Redmond faced the complex realities of being a black woman whose achievements challenged the established medical hierarchy. On August 12th, Redmond arrived at the headquarters of the 12th Field Hospital Group in recently liberated Paris. She had been summoned to present her plasma substitute methodology to a conference of senior medical officers responsible for battlefield medicine policies across the European front. It was a rare opportunity for a lieutenant, particularly a black female lieutenant, to address such a high-ranking audience. The conference room at the requisitioned Hôtel Crillon was filled with colonels and majors when Redmond entered. Many had traveled from various sectors of the front specifically to hear about the technique that reports claimed had saved over 150 men who otherwise would have died. The atmosphere was a mixture of professional curiosity and skepticism, the latter particularly evident among some of the older physicians who had decades of formal medical research experience. Colonel Richard Maxwell, the senior medical officer presiding over the conference, introduced Redmond with notable formality. "Gentlemen, we have asked Lieutenant Redmond to present her emergency plasma protocol that was implemented under battlefield conditions at the 322nd Field Hospital. I remind you that this technique was developed under extreme circumstances when conventional supplies were unavailable. We are here to evaluate its potential as a standardized emergency procedure." For the next hour, Redmond methodically explained her process, supporting each point with carefully documented data from the cases at the 322nd. Her presentation was precise, scientific, and delivered with a quiet confidence that impressed even her most skeptical listeners. She described not only the formulation, but the quality control processes she had implemented to ensure patient safety, often the most significant concern with improvised medical treatments. The question period that followed revealed the mixed reception to her work. Several younger medical officers who had served in forward hospitals immediately recognized the potential value of her technique for emergency situations. Others raised technical concerns about standardization across different field conditions. A few expressed thinly veiled discomfort with taking direction from a nurse, particularly one who was black. Major William Stevenson, a Harvard-trained physician with a reputation for academic rigidity, posed the most challenging questions. "Lieutenant, while your improvisation may have been justified under extreme circumstances, surely you don't suggest this should become standard protocol? The potential for adverse reactions when deviating from established pharmaceutical standards." Redmond interrupted him with a precision that silenced the room. "Major, I have brought the complete data on all 187 patients who received this treatment. The adverse reaction rate was 4.8%, lower than the 3% documented with standard field plasma administration under battlefield conditions. I would be happy to review the case-by-case documentation with you." She placed a thick folder of patient records on the table. Colonel Maxwell intervened, clearly impressed by Redmond's command of her data. "The lieutenant's results speak for themselves, gentlemen. What we're discussing is not replacing standard plasma when available, but having an established emergency protocol when supply lines fail, as they inevitably do in combat conditions." By the conclusion of the conference, the majority of the medical officers had been convinced of the protocol's value. Colonel Maxwell announced that a formal field trial would be implemented across 6 field hospitals, with Redmond temporarily assigned to oversee training of personnel. If successful, the technique would be incorporated into the official field medical manual as an emergency procedure. This professional victory, however, was accompanied by personal and institutional challenges that revealed the persistence of racial and gender barriers even in the midst of war. When arrangements were being made for Redmond's temporary quarters in Paris during the training program, she was initially denied accommodations in the officer's billet, despite her rank. It took direct intervention from Colonel Maxwell to correct this situation. During the training sessions themselves, Redmond encountered a range of responses from medical personnel. Many, particularly those who had experienced supply shortages firsthand, were eager to learn her techniques and treated her with professional respect. Others made their resistance clear, with some physicians refusing to take instruction from a black nurse, regardless of her expertise. Captain James Reynolds, a medical officer from a Georgia field hospital, was openly contemptuous during one training session. "I'm not taking orders from a colored nurse," he declared loudly. "This isn't how medicine is supposed to work." Redmond's response became legendary among the medical units. Without raising her voice, she replied, "Captain, medicine works by saving lives with the best means available. I've documented 156 men who survived because of this technique. How many have you saved with your prejudice?" Reynolds was reassigned the following day after Colonel Maxwell received reports of the incident. The message was clear. In the midst of the largest military conflict in history, competence and life-saving innovation outweighed prejudice, at least in this specific context. By September 1944, the field trial of the Redmond Protocol was underway in selected field hospitals across the European theater. Redmond traveled between these units, ensuring consistent implementation and troubleshooting issues that arose under different field conditions. Her ability to adapt the basic technique to varying situations and equipment availability further demonstrated the protocol's value. The 47th Field Hospital near Aachen, Germany, provided the most dramatic validation of the technique when German artillery destroyed their supply convoy in October 1944. Using Redmond's protocol, they were able to produce emergency plasma substitute for 3 days until new supplies reached them. The hospital commander credited the technique with saving at least 40 lives during this period. As Redmond's temporary assignment to headquarters neared its end, the question of formal recognition for her contribution arose. Colonel Maxwell had submitted a recommendation for the Legion of Merit, a decoration rarely awarded to nurses and almost never to black service members. The recommendation cited her exceptional technical innovation under battlefield conditions, resulting in a life-saving medical procedure that has been successfully implemented across multiple field hospitals. The recommendation faced resistance at higher levels of command. Some objected to awarding such a high honor to a lieutenant. Others were uncomfortable with the precedent of recognizing a black woman for medical innovation. Internal memoranda uncovered by historians decades later reveal the debate that occurred beyond Redmond's knowledge. One unsigned note attached to the recommendation file stated, "While the technical contribution is acknowledged, is this the appropriate message to send about the proper roles within the medical corps? Recognition at the local level would be more suitable." Colonel Maxwell's response, preserved in the same file, was unequivocal. "The appropriate message is that innovation saving American lives will be recognized regardless of the innovator's rank, race, or gender. I have 156 men who would likely be dead without Lieutenant Redmond's work. I am maintaining the recommendation as submitted." In the end, a compromise was reached. Redmond would receive the Bronze Star with V device for valor, still a significant recognition, but a step below the originally recommended Legion of Merit. The citation was carefully worded to recognize her technical skill and devotion to duty, while somewhat diminishing the scope of her scientific innovation. When the medal was presented in November 1944, The ceremony was held at a small field hospital rather than headquarters, with minimal publicity. Only a brief mention appeared in Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, and even this referred simply to a nurse at the 382nd Field Hospital, without naming Redmond specifically. This pattern of simultaneous recognition and marginalization characterized the official response to Redmond's contribution throughout the remainder of the war. Her protocol was adopted and implemented, saving hundreds of additional lives, but her name was gradually removed from official documentation. By early 1945, the technique was being referred to in medical bulletins simply as the Emergency Plasma Protocol, or Field Expedient Plasma Substitute. Redmond herself was reassigned to the 359th Station Hospital in England in December 1944, returning to regular nursing duties. Her temporary promotion to first lieutenant, granted during her special assignment, was rescinded, returning her to second lieutenant, a move that many of her colleagues viewed as unjust given her contributions. Yet despite these institutional limitations, word of Redmond's innovation spread through informal networks across both the European and Pacific theaters. Medical personnel who had witnessed the effectiveness of her technique carried the knowledge with them as they transferred between units. In many cases, they continued to refer to it as Redmond's mix among themselves, ensuring that at the practical level, her contribution remained acknowledged. When Dorothy Redmond returned to the United States in August 1945, following Germany's surrender, she carried with her the Bronze Star Medal, detailed documentation of her plasma substitute protocol, and first-hand experience of both the professional recognition and institutional discrimination that had characterized her military service. Like many black veterans returning home, she found that America remained largely unchanged in its racial attitudes despite the shared sacrifices of the war. Upon her discharge from the Army Nurse Corps in October 1945, Redmond sought to continue her medical career, applying to several Philadelphia hospitals for positions that would utilize her expanded wartime experience. Despite her distinguished service record and unique expertise in emergency blood products, she was repeatedly rejected from white hospitals and offered only basic nursing positions at underfunded black hospitals, positions that made no use of her specialized knowledge. "They wanted to put me back on the general ward as if the war had never happened," she later recalled in a 1975 interview. "It was as though all that knowledge and experience simply didn't matter once I was back on American soil." Unwilling to accept this limitation, Redmond made a pivotal decision that would eventually lead to the preservation and recognition of her innovation. She applied to Howard University's medical program, using her GI Bill benefits to pursue formal medical training. Though initially rejected, the school accepted only a small number of women at that time. She persisted, submitting her complete documentation from the European theatre and gaining the support of Dr. Charles Drew, who remembered her from their pre-war interaction and recognized the significance of her battlefield innovation. With Drew's recommendation, Redmond was admitted to Howard University College of Medicine in 1946. For the next 4 years, she balanced her studies with efforts to document and formalize the emergency plasma protocol she had developed under battlefield conditions. Working in Drew's research laboratory during her limited free time, she refined the technique, conducted controlled studies on its efficacy, and prepared formal scientific documentation of her findings. In 1950, the Journal of Emergency Medicine published Redmond's first scientific paper, Field Expedient Plasma Substitutes, Development and Application in Combat Conditions. Though the journal was not among the most prestigious medical publications, the article represented the first formal peer-reviewed documentation of her wartime innovation. Significantly, it established her clear priority as the technique's developer at a time when several white male physicians had begun publishing papers on similar approaches without acknowledging her prior work. After completing her medical degree in 1950, Dr. Dorothy Redmond, as she was now properly addressed, accepted a position at Freedman's Hospital in Washington, D.C., where she established a research program focused on emergency blood products. Operating with minimal funding and equipment that was often second-hand from better-resourced white institutions, she nevertheless built a reputation for rigorous science and practical innovation. The Korean War brought renewed interest in emergency battlefield medicine, and in 1952, Redmond's work gained unexpected attention when several MASH, Mobile Army Surgical Hospital units, reported using adapted versions of her plasma substitute protocol when supply lines were compromised during the chaotic early stages of the conflict. Army medical records from this period contain multiple references to the Redmond method being employed during critical supply shortages, particularly during the massive Chinese offensive in late 1950. This renewed practical application of her work led to a formal inquiry from the Army Medical Corps, seeking more information about the technique that field units were implementing. The inquiry revealed an institutional amnesia that was both frustrating and illuminating. The very protocol that had been officially adopted, albeit with diminished attribution, during World War II, had been largely forgotten by the military medical establishment in the brief intervening years. Redmond responded with characteristic thoroughness, providing complete documentation not only of the original battlefield development, but also of her subsequent refinements. This time, with her credentials as a PhySci,